Present from GRI Secretariat today are Bastian Buck, Chief of Standards, Elodie Cherney, Manager Standards, and Harold Powell's Director Standard. We will now start with a roll call. Anna Nefedova.
Here.
Thank you. Corey LaRue.
Present. Good afternoon.
Evan Harvey.
Hello, here.
Gangacharan Sharma.
Hi, hello.
Kent Swift.
Present.
Thank you, Kent. Laura Garner Carter.
Present.
Michelle Vassar.
Present.
Peter Colley.
Present.
Robin Neeson.
Present.
Vincent Kong.
Present.
And GSSB Chair Judy Kosewski.
Present.
Thank you, everyone. GSSB members Julia Genuadi will join. And Jennifer Princing and Joseph Martin have sent their apologies. I will now hand back over to Judy Kosewski to open the meeting.
Thank you very much, Jill. Good day, everyone. Welcome to this meeting of the GSSB. Jill, before we get started, can I confirm whether we've achieved quorum in the last couple of minutes?
Judy, yes, we have.
Great. Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you very much for your time today. We have a number of interesting items and a little bit of housekeeping as well.
It doesn't take this long. You're clear on tomorrow, right?
1 minute, just I will. No, that is Teams.
Sign in.
1 minute.
Sign in. I think were logged out.
No, this is Teams, not.
I know. If one is logged out, others might also have been. Yeah, that's right. No, it's hanged. You need to log in, log off, log in again.
Looks, perhaps have we, here we go. Excellent.
We're back. Okay.
Right.
Go ahead.
Okay. Excellent. Okay. Fingers crossed that this now works for all of us. Hold your breath, everyone. Okay. All right. Here's our agenda for today. We have got a number of things to sort through. The first thing that we need to do is to just clean up the approvals of the last two meeting summaries. We, as you recall, we skipped doing this our last meeting in favor of waiting for a quorum. We now have quorum today, so we can approve those two meeting summaries. We'll then have a relatively short update from the standards division, just on general kind of catch up. We have an important approval, which is the GRI topic standard project for labor-related standards. And we will have Harold talk to us about that, and hopefully we'll get an approval of that project plan, followed by an update from the biodiversity standard project. And then finally, finally, before the close of the public meeting, we are happy to welcome representation from the living income community of practice to talk with us on the subject of living income and living wage, which is another one of our inputs into the discussion of our forthcoming work plan, as we have been doing in recent meetings. And so we'll be happy to hear about that. And then we'll close the meeting, the public meeting, and we will have a half an hour for the private session. I'm not aware of any other items that have been raised, but we'll check in at the very end of the public meeting to see if there's any other business at that point. Are there any questions about the agenda? Okay, very good. Shall we carry on then? All right, the first item, as I said, is the scheduled approvals of items 1 and 2, which are the draft summaries of our most recent GSSB meetings held on the 19th of May and the 16th of June. I'll take this as two separate approvals. First of all, in reference to item 1, the draft summary of the GSSB meeting held on the 19th of May 2022. The GSSB resolves to approve this. Are there any concerns, comments, any edits that anyone has to share at this point? Hearing none, that is approved. Thank you very much. Item 2, same question. The GSSB resolves to approve item 2, draft summary of the GSSB meeting held on the 16th of June 2022. Any objections or concerns or edits? Hearing none, thank you very much. Those two items are approved. Right, Bastian, over to you. And I can't hear you. I don't know if others can.
No, we can't either.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, perfect. So for the update today, since we had a meeting very recently, I will speak to some of the recent events in terms of public-facing activities and not project updates. Specifically, Elodie, of course, will join us later to have an in-depth briefing on the biodiversity project, which is one of the ongoing standard-setting activities. Can we move to the next slide? Okay, we're still struggling a bit with the technology, but what I wanted to share with you is that we had a chance to launch and publicly release the GRI 13, Agriculture, Aquaculture and Fishing. The release was on the 28th of June. We have had the launch on the 30th. So we were combining a public release with a launch event specifically, and I'll give a bit more pointers about these two activities. We have, with the launch on the 28th of June, we had the opportunity to leverage our database, those that have signed up to receive updates around standard setting activities. We've also leveraged the social media channels. So to give you an idea, or through LinkedIn and Twitter, with audience of 116,000 and 39,500 respectively, we created 22,000 impressions for the launch moment. We sent out a notification about the release to 150,000 people with a 30% opening rate. And we highlighted this in the GI newsletter, which is distributed to 125,000 people with a 27% opening rate. So there was a fair bit of exposure with audiences that have opted in for information from GI on standard setting activities. We're also very pleased to colleagues in our communications and external affairs have worked very hard to get us media mentionings and articles on the subject. Sorry, guys. We have seen pickup in a number of outlets: Bloomberg, ESG Today, Environmental Analyst, and others. And we can share that also with you to give you an overview of the coverage that the standard has received upon launch. Next slide, please. So for the launch event specifically, we had around about 1,000 participants. So very strong followership there. We even had 2,500 people registered, and those will receive the recording, or have received, as a matter of fact, the recording. So that was a very successful event. We were looking at of course, somewhat limited audience compared to the general standard setting project. So this is a great success. And the format was also one that we would like to see employed going forward with key stakeholders to the subject matter at hand coming in, sharing their perspectives. So we had the OECD highlighting the role of reporting from the OECD FAO guidance for responsible agricultural supply chains. The FAO provided the perspective on corporate sustainability reporting and why the underlying data matters. And WBA highlighted the findings from the recent benchmark assessment of sustainability performance of 350 keystone food companies, and explained how transparency will enhance their ability to benchmark companies. So it was very successful event. Also a very positive conclusion of a process and actually the whole pilot for the sector standards. And I think seeing that we're now able to carry through the standard setting side of it, but also working with the full institution to launch this was very important for us. In other positive news, I wanted to share also that we have an update on the second quarter in terms of GI standards downloads, and we continue to see a very positive trend. Year on year, we have a 50%, 1% growth in total downloads, 250,000 downloads of the GRI standards in the second quarter, with around about 19,000 new registered users. So these are stakeholders that haven't actually interacted with GRI through the download of standards before and have left us with information that they now form part of the practitioners that interact with our core product. Top 3 regions, Europe with the lion's share of the downloads, up by 50%, Asia with 75,000, up by 57%, and Latin America with 35,000, up by 56%. So very positive indeed. We continue to look at how this is evolving, but the rapid growth year on year seems to continue, which I think is a good signal for all the hard work in the background, public facing with you overseeing standards that we actually have traction with the market for the standards we put out. I leave it at that, and we move to the next session. Well, maybe if there are any, sorry, of course, if there are any questions, please, this is the moment.
Any questions for Bastian following that short update? Okay, I don't see any hands up, but please do let me know if I've missed anything. If there are none, then we'll move swiftly to Harold to talk with us about the topic standard project for labor. And this is, again, this is a project proposal to be approved today, hopefully. Harold, over to you.
Thank you very much, Judy. And indeed, we have completed the draft proposal for the GRI labor-related topic standards, and I call it a revision program because a lot of standards are involved. And the need for this project, as we showed in the draft proposal which you received, the need for this project was identified and prioritized also as a second part of the review project for human-related GRI standards. And after the very successful publication of the universal standards last year, the end of last year, we started the preparation of the proposal. And yeah, we ended up with this, I would say, ambitious, pretty ambitious revision program for all the GRI labor-related topic standards. This proposal is presented to you for discussion and approval today, and it's based on a lot of research, but also background discussions with ILO, the global unions, and the employers, because it's labor-related. So also Peter and Loredana were involved from a GSSB perspective. The project objective is to review the labor-related topic standards and to bring the standards in line with the authoritative references. You see some of them here. Of course, the United Nations GPs, the OECD guidelines for the multinational enterprises, and the International Labour Organization conventions and recommendations, obviously. I see that Judy can't see the slide deck. I can see it, but is no one else able to see it?
No, we can't see it.
I can see slide 12.
I can
see Peter.
I can see 12.
Oh gosh.
I see slide 9 actually.
This is quite bizarre.
I'm on slide 8.
I have got the PDF of the slide deck open next to me here. Harold, if you wouldn't mind just confirming the slide number that we're on as we move through this, in case people are off track, and so that we can follow along on our own if we need to.
No problem.
Thank you.
Problem. So no panic. We're at slide 12. This is the project objective, and it's also in the proposal. Of course, I'm still at the first slide, talking about the topic standards set and also about the authoritative instruments. Just get on track again. Still on slide 12, the project objective is really just to review all the topic standards because the content is quite old. Sorry? There is someone still. Ganga,
would you please
mind
just make sure you
yourself?
put yourself on mute? Yeah.
Thank you very much. So the objective is to review the content because it's quite old and still very sustainable, but there's a lot has happened and we have to bring it in line with the authoritative instruments via multi-stakeholder process, of course, and because of the number of standards involved, the programmatic approach will be used. And we will include at least the review of the standards listed on slide 12. So market presence, employment, labor, management relations, up to the forced and compulsory labor one, the standard 409. It could be more involved. It depends on the early, more in-depth discussions on the scope with the experts in the technical committee. But at least these are all identified as labor-related standards. And yes, this project includes, but it's not only limited to the assessment of our disclosures and guidances. We also have to look at all the emerging topics like, of course, decent work, labor practices, human rights related to gig and the platform economy was already raised by the workers and the employers. So we will have to research that, and if necessary, disclosures will be deleted, revised, or added, and even we could recommend new standards to make sure that we are in line, and we are also in line with universal standards and with the inclusion of the human rights and the due diligence approach. So yes, next slide, please. So we go to slide 13. That's the division of responsibilities. And the slide you see a phrase technical committee and one with advisory group on it. As the scope of this project is all about labor and work-related topics, we will approach this with several layers of engagement, as already mentioned last meeting. And we have proposed it with the experts comprising a group, specifically from the ILO, the employers and the unions representations, and also augmented by a stakeholder perspective via an advisory group. So why we do that? Because of the multi-stakeholder approach, we have this core group, but also supported and advised by an advisory group with experts in it. The recommendations and the formal recommendations will, of course, come from the technical committee. That's absolutely the role. For the core group, so the technical committee, we already consulted with ILO, with the global unions, and with the global employer organization, and we have identified already six experts, and they're also, so we are able to nominate them very soon, and they are nominated to contribute to this project, to this program, with their expertise, and to make sure we come up with new standards and recommendations. For the advisory group, we will launch a call for experts in September. We envision a small group, but just to make sure all constituencies are involved in the entire project. And a small group is 4 to 6 experts being involved. Of course, we will bring forward, after the open launch for experts, we'll bring the nominations to the GSSB for approval. And of course, as standards division, we're ready to manage the project and to develop the standards in accordance with the due process protocol and support TC and AG. We have already a project team ready to start. Yes, next slide, please. Now my
Sorry, yeah, I'm having.
Yes, it's almost coming. No problem, Jill, no problem. Well, anyway, we go to the next one. This is slide 14 in your slide deck. And this is about, just to explain why we are having a programmatic approach. So due to the complexity of the project, with at least 8 topic standards, but probably more, we have chosen this programmatic approach because that allows us to group related topics and subject into several project phases, and the different projects can be run in parallel. So we're able to ensure an integrated approach, which we need. And we're also able to align, to have aligned set of standards as outcome. Thank Thank you, Jill. Jill, one slide further, please. Still on 14. Yes, this is 14. So the review of the individual standards and the development of potential new standards or disclosures related to labor will be carried out at least in 2 project phases, and it could be 3, but I hope that we could keep it in 2 or 3 phases. And we expect that the burden of the content creation will be until December 2023. So next slide, please. This is the final slide. This is the scheme, the proposed timeline, which you can see also in the project proposal. So this is slide 15 in the slide deck. And the 2 different colors are just to explain that there is a nice parallel approach here, a programmatic approach. This can differ a little bit from this 25-month timeline. But you can see that, of course, we have a pretty heavy content development, and there will be a first set of standards be ready after 10 to 12 months, and then the next set of standards will be a little bit later. If necessary, we could need an extra phase for instance, a final set of standards or even a new standard to be developed. Again, of course, we come back to the GSSB with the terms of reference of the TC with the proposed nomination of experts and with the more detailed program, the exact timelines and the exact periods for the different standards. I think this is the conclusion. So I would say let's have a discussion or open the floor for questions. And I hope for clarification, maybe some final comment. Yeah. So the next, sorry, Judy, the next steps will be if we have an approval that we have to send it still to the, as you mentioned in the proposal, still to the GRI board and stakeholder council for their even final comments. After their approval, I would propose to have it by correspondence, formal approval in accordance with the due process protocol. And then we can continue with the TC nominations and the launch of the experts for the advisory group. Back to you, Judy.
Okay, thank you, Harold, for that. Maybe a couple of points of just clarification that come up from my side, which have to do with the fact that this proposed project is quite extensive. You know, it sort of expands across a whole range of existing standards and potentially, you know, opens the door to new ones, significantly revised ones, all the rest of it. To what extent is this likely to, you know, as it unfolds, we might find that there are certain kind of limited or specific tasks or sub-projects that come out of it. To what extent should we expect to just kind of take this as it comes and see, you know, how many individual work streams are generated as a result of it? I'm sort of, if we look at the proposed timeline, I mean, I think the reality might be that those you know, sort of longer bars of yellow, there might be kind of lots of little individual shorter bars of yellow, if that makes sense. Could you just speak to that kind of dynamic a little bit, Harold?
Yes, absolutely. And indeed, so from project management approach and from the scope perspective, it's very important to keep that, I would say, the box closed. So in the project proposal, I also, oh, sorry, we will not touch upon because they are revised recently, like the 403. But there are some, yeah, there could be some small things we just want to change there. Also, like if you start having discussions on labor, you could of course have discussions on the universal standards from the start. We say, well, we don't want to touch upon that. So if something comes up there, then it will be recommendations first to the GSSB. That would be my thought on this, and really strictly stay to the set of standards we proposed in this project proposal. That's difficult enough. As we envisage it now, there are some easier The first phase will be the easy ones, we would say, and then we start with maybe more difficult ones. And easy ones, I mean that less revision, less content development is needed for, let's say, the first 3 or 4 standards. But that really depends, of course, on the discussions we have. But that's based on the research we did now. So really, we would like to avoid to have like 5 or 6 or 7 project phases, but. And to avoid to expand this project now. If we run into other things, we will propose it to the GSSB first.
Yeah, I'm definitely not proposing expanding anything here. I'm merely sort of reacting to what I see to be the kind of likely reality that some of these topic standards and the specific issues that fall out of it. Pertaining, for example, to gig work or what have you, there may very well be the need to kind of have a dedicated ability to study some of those individual issues, which means that there's probably a lot of concurrent activity across a lot of different tasks happening at all stages of all of this, and I think it's just likely that there'll be some interim results that come for GSSB, update, understanding, and maybe a bit of feedback at different times from one another, notwithstanding the overall project timeline.
Agree, yeah, absolutely. So it will be, for sure, it will be ambitious, and we should stay within our lines. So.
Okay.
Other questions?
Peter, please go ahead.
Thank you. Yes, well, thank you, Harold, for the presentation. And yes, Harold's presentation is thorough, and it does concur with the discussions that I've had on behalf of Labor with the GSSB, with the Standards Division. The list of topics, as Harold has pointed out, is well, it's a moving feast in a way. We have the existing set of topics. And if you actually can remember them, some of them are very brief. There's a moderate amount of description, very little in the way of disclosures. So they're clearly strongly in need of revision. There's been dividing lines drawn, like 403 occupational safety has been previously revised, so clearly it doesn't require revision. At the moment, 406 non-discrimination is not in there. Now that is a core labour standard, but it also covers a lot of non-employment or non-labour related discrimination issues. So at the moment, it's out of the mix to be dealt with separately, but it may well be covered in one way or another in the work of this technical committee and advisory group. I'll leave it there. It is a big project. It's a very necessary project. It was going to be in quite a tight time frame. The time frame is now expanded out a bit, so it's a more realistic project proposal. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. And I think that's definitely I completely concur with your views on this, and maybe just another follow-up, which is that the proposed technical committee and advisory group, it's a relatively modest size of group, especially for a very broad range of potential topics. Is there any thought given to on an ad hoc basis, kind of reaching out to sources of specific expertise where it concerns one or another of these, project tasks or sub work streams, to ensure that, that there's at least a little bit of a burden sharing and the ability to, kind of check along the way that we're getting enough advice during the drafting process.
Yes, well, that's well spotted, and I would say it's spot on, because that's exactly how we would like to approach it. But we would like to keep the TC small, simply because it's a difficult topic.
Yeah.
And but the other question was how to make sure that all stakeholders are involved. So that this is now the approach we've chosen to make sure all the entire multi-stakeholder process is very strongly the project. So that this is the way to go.
Okay. And any other questions or items that members would like to discuss? Corley, I'm not able, just for technical reasons, to read your chat at the moment. Could you possibly share your comment?
Certainly, Judy. It's really just a apologies, a typo in the actual proposal document at line 112 seems to be incomplete. So it's just a minor note.
Yeah, so I can fill it in. I also recognized it after we sent it. So I mentioned it in the presentation. The call for experts will be launched, and then it says and then it stops September.
Very good. Thank you. Well spotted, Corley. All right. Any other discussion items on this? Okay, hearing none. Shall we move to the approval, which we have in front of us? If people can see the deck, it's slide 16. And so therefore, I would like to ask for any objections or concerns related to the proposed topic standard labor topics draft project proposal. This is item 3. Hearing none, thank you very much, Harold, and all colleagues. This is approved. That'll be a very exciting and worthwhile project, and in fact, you know, kind of set of projects, and we'll certainly look forward to supporting its implementation over the next few months.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Harold. I'm going to turn it over to Elodie from the Standards Division, who is going to give us an update on the biodiversity project that is ongoing right now. Elodie, please, over to you.
Hi, everyone, and thank you, Judy, for the introduction. So yes, indeed, today I'll give you a progress update on the topic standard project for biodiversity. So we are now, if we can move to the next slide, that would be slide 18 in your slide deck. And starting here with a recap of the timeline for this project. So this is actually quite similar to the update that you received in the last GSSB meeting, so I'll cover this quickly. We are currently revisiting the draft that was discussed with the technical committee in June. We are scheduling 2 additional meetings with them in the first half of September and late October to finalize the exposure draft, which would be presented to the GSSB for approval at your meeting in November. And pending GSSB approval, the public comment period is expected to start in early December, which will coincide finally with the Conference of the Party, the COP of the UN Convention on Biological Diversity. Sorry. Yes, so the COP of the UN Convention on Biological Diversity, which has been postponed several times over the past 2 years and has now been announced to take place in the first half of December in Montreal with the Chinese and Canadian governments as co-hosts. If we can move to slide 19. So before diving into the standard and the disclosures themselves, I would like to give you an overview of the diverse collaborations and efforts to align with several intergovernmental instruments and other biodiversity-related initiatives that are really informing the development of the draft. And the particularity of this project is that these instruments are pretty much all under development, and as we are also developing our own disclosures, so we need to pay particular attention to these developments to inform the draft, the drafting of the exposure draft for the biodiversity standard. So a lot of acronyms there. So I will start with, as I mentioned earlier, the UN Convention on Biological Diversity, the CBD. They are finalizing the post-2020 global biodiversity framework that would define the global goals and targets to ensure that by 2050, the shared vision of living in harmony with nature is fulfilled. And they're also proposing targets to be reached by 2030. And we want to ensure that our standard will be aligned with the final UN framework. So the initial draft has been an input to our work so far, but a lot remains to be agreed upon at the COP in December. So that will be a key input to our public comment process. Then, as you would know, GRI is a partner to the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, the TNFD. They have released their beta framework, which is also an input to our work. They will also work closely with the ISSB. So in that sense, we're also complementing each other to enable organizations to report both on their biodiversity impacts and dependencies. We also now have an agreement with the Science Based Target Network, SBTN, that will allow us to also exchange information more closely as they are developing detailed guidance for businesses to assess and measure their impact, as well as their dependencies on biodiversity. Several of our technical committee members are involved in the work of the TNFD and SBTN, so that also helps ensuring alignment. So the Aligning Accounting Approaches for Nature, or ALIGN project, is also a project led by the Natural Capital Coalitions and UNEP WCMC. They are also developing relevant guidance that capture best practice to measure and account for impacts on biodiversity. And two of our the members of the Biodiversity Technical Committee are also leading this effort. And this has also been a key technical input to the draft of some of our disclosures. There's also the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, IPBES, or IPBES, which is represented in our technical committee by a member who's also an expert taking part in IPBES discussions and a working group on business and biodiversity. I hear my echo. Yeah, no, that's fine. So the IPBES assessments have been also an input to our work, and also good to keep in mind is that they are going to conduct a methodological assessment of the impacts and dependencies of business on biodiversity. So that's a year-long effort that falls outside the scope of our project, but the IPBES plenary is actually approving this month and this week, I think, the scope of this assessment. So that's also something we're looking at to make sure that we are aligned with their work. And the Partnership for Biodiversity Accounting Financials, or PBAF, is also another partnership that facilitates actually the financial community to assess and disclose their impact on biodiversity. So, and they're also represented in our technical committee, also involved in these other initiatives, including ALIGN. So, so here's it's an overview of all the main technical input to our work. On slide 20, here you also see how we are collaborating with other benchmarking and reporting frameworks as well to ensure alignment across all. So you will know that the EU EFRAG standards are under public comment at the moment, and that include the the draft for the biodiversity and ecosystems standard. We've had many exchanges with their technical team, and also they had discussions with our experts, our technical committee, mostly in the late 2021. We also had follow-up discussions recently with them to discuss our feedback to their draft, and we aim to align with our content to the greatest extent possible. Next, the CDP is represented in our technical committee, and they are also currently using our initial draft as an input into the revision of their questionnaires, as they intend to include more biodiversity-related information in those, and we intend again to align with each other. The WBA, or World Benchmarking Alliance, released the nature benchmark earlier this year, so in April. So we were able to provide input to the draft, and we also are part of the expert review committee. So we will keep a close collaboration with them over the next couple of years throughout the benchmarking cycle. And finally, we also have connections with the ISO, which has also just started the review of the biodiversity standard. So again, some of our technical committee members are involved in that work, and we are also a liaison partner. So also they have a different timeline than us. We aim to have further exchanges with our technical groups in the coming months. If we can move to the next slide, it's slide 21. So here's an overview of the disclosures that we are currently developing for the revised GRI biodiversity standard. Again, just as a quick recap of the process, so we conducted several scoping interviews with the expert in late 2021, and since we had several thematic subgroup meetings in the period from January to April. And since May, we've collated all of these, the outcome of this discussion into a first draft that was shared with the technical committee. They provided feedback, and we are now incorporating the feedback in the next iteration of the draft. We've had 4 technical committee, like a full plenary meeting during that period, and Kim Schumacher and Michel Vacher as well were attended those meetings as GSSB sponsors. And here, so how the main themes that would be covered or are proposed to be covered by the disclosures. And also perhaps a general feedback that was made by the technical committee early in the process is that one of the main gaps in the current disclosures is the lack of coverage of the entire value chain. Specifically, some companies will impact biodiversity mostly through their direct operations. So here you can think of a mining company or a fishing company, while many other companies would impact biodiversity through the sourcing of raw materials or ingredients that would be used in their product. So you can think, for instance, of a food company that would source, let's say, palm oil or other commodities. So for each disclosure, we're also assessing which segment of the value chain is covered, the type of information that can be reported as well. So in terms of the disclosures themselves, so it was stressed that an organization impacts on biodiversity are very much location specific. So that means that the same activity can have a very different impact depending on where it occurs, unlike climate change, for instance, where the impact is global, irrespective of the origin of the greenhouse gas emissions. And location, therefore, matters greatly for the identification, the assessment, and management of biodiversity impacts. So here, we have a disclosure that will require organizations to disclose information on the location of the operations that are responsible for the most significant on biodiversity, as well as information regarding the proximity to area of high biodiversity values, so protected area, key biodiversity areas. So the organization covers the organization value chain, but the type of information or the level of precision required would not be the same when the organization report for their own operation and when they report for their supply chain. Then next, the direct drivers of biodiversity loss. So the IP-based global biodiversity assessment identifies 5 key direct drivers leading to the loss of biodiversity. Those are climate change, invasive alien species, land and sea use change, the overexploitation of resources, and pollution. And so that will be reflected as well in our standard. So how an organization contributes to these drivers of biodiversity loss. Also, what's important to keep in mind is that in many cases for organizations with complex value chains or whose impacts are located essentially in their supply chain, this information is essential for them to understand how they impact biodiversity. Because very specific information on, the number of species that were lost through the sourcing of palm oil, for instance, is unlikely to be known. That's not an information that's easily transferable across the value chain. However, information on, let's say, hectare of land use are converted, if we talk about land use change, or about the quantity of pesticide use, for instance, when we talk about pollution, can be more easily known. So that's that information on the contribution of an organizations to the drivers of biodiversity loss can provide an understanding of its impact on biodiversity. And that's an information that can be accessed either through data that they collect themselves, or that can be also estimated through different tools such as life cycle analysis, for instance. Next, so the state of biodiversity refers to disclosing information on ecosystem and species affected. And from the latest discussion with the technical committee, it's recommended to really focus on disclosing information on the size and condition of ecosystem affected, which again can be measured directly or can be estimated. And organization would also be recommended to disclose further information on species, such as the extinction risk or population size of species affected for their own operation. So if they have access to that information. We are also proposing a disclosure for organizations to describe the ecosystem services affected, and that include both the ecosystem services that they depend on and those that they impact. So we had many conversations with the technical committee members about an organization's dependencies on biodiversity, which is an aspect that they would have liked to see, but obviously falls outside of the scope of our standard as we are focusing on impact. And here this information does not intend to get into assessing or evaluating dependencies as such, but really will help provide a general understanding of an organization's relation with biodiversity, to help understanding how they impact biodiversity, as well as how they impact stakeholders, and in particular indigenous peoples and local communities. And finally, we will have several management related disclosures. We are currently reorganizing that content and we're still assessing different options, but at this stage we will have either 2 or 3 separate disclosures that will complement disclosure 3.3 in GRI 3. One will focus on an organization's approach to no net loss and net gain of biodiversity, and how the organization intends to implement such commitments. That's also where the final UN framework will enter into play, as it's going to define the global ambitions in this respect. Management disclosures will also require organizations to explain how they implement the steps of the mitigation hierarchy to manage the impacts. And we also have requirement that will require information on an organization's compliance with global instruments related to trade of species and access and benefit sharing. So that access and benefit sharing refer to the way in which genetic resources may be accessed, and how the benefit that result from their use are shared between organizations that are using the resources and the countries or the people that provide those resources. So if we move to slide 22, that's the last slide. So we've had a lot of rich discussion with the technical committee over the past months, and this slide highlights some of the discussion that are still ongoing. So first, as you would have gathered from this presentation, is that many of the instruments we rely on are still under development. So that creates some level of uncertainties with some of the elements that we are discussing with the technical committee. So we are obviously looking closely at the UN development. But some of the area where somehow we lack some level of global consensus is around the direct drivers of biodiversity loss, and having a methodology or approved methodology to measure an organization contribution to those. At the moment, one of the key remaining point of discussion relates to the overexploitation of resources, and what would make sense to disclose to complement the management approach of an organization. We also have still several questions remaining around baselines and cutoff date that have been proposed by the different technical committee members, and how these should be defined by organizations. And that's where also some global guidance on the matter, I think, is still lacking. Another point as well is that, as mentioned earlier, reporting information across the value chain is essential, and that was really strongly recommended by the technical committee from the start. And as we dive deeper in the requirements and the reporting expectations that we are creating, we are still clarifying with them some aspect, in some respect, what is feasible to report. And I think especially when it comes to the downstream value chain and what data is really available and can be realistically required for organization to report. And a couple of other points. So it has also been emphasized that the current disclosures are really focusing on impacts on the land and does not necessarily allow to report well impacts in the marine environment. So we are also looking at adapting the language where needed. So for instance, when we talk about sites that are owned, leased or managed, those are elements that we need to look at. We are revising. And one last point as well, it's the experts use a slightly different language around impact. So they are talking about direct, indirect, cumulative impact. And we also are making sure that this is integrated in a manner that is in line with the revised universal standard and the due diligence approach on causing, contributing, and being directly linked to an impact. So not necessarily a major issue, but one of the technicality that need attention to ensure coherence across our standards. So I will stop here, and yes, I'm now happy to take any questions that you may have.
Many thanks, Elodie. Any questions or observations from the GSSB? Well, I'm not hearing any, so I think I can just say thank you very much, Elodie, for that comprehensive update. That is very informative, and we will be looking forward to following the progress as it transpires. But thank you very much for now. Please extend our thanks to the technical committee as well.
Thanks, I would do.
Excellent. So we have next on our agenda, we have a discussion of the living income community of practice, which is being brought to us by Kristen Komives and Sheila, I beg your pardon, Sunitha Raja from the ISEAL Alliance. And they're going to talk to us about this is in connection with the review of our forthcoming work program rather. So please, do we have our guests on the line? And can we turn it over to them now?
Yes, hello, I'm here. I'm Kristen Komives, and I will
Thank you very much.
Presentation today. Yes, just one technical question. Will you be moving the slides for me? Or should I be sharing my slides?
I think Jill is driving the slide deck.
Okay, great.
So yes, just let her know when.
Sorry, yes, thank you, Judy. I will move them for you, Kristen, whenever you need to.
Okay, great. Well, let's go ahead and go to the first slide then. And I'll just thank you for the invitation to speak to you today. Also to listen to the update on your biodiversity work, which was quite interesting and I think has in some ways some parallels to what we're going to be discussing today. So as mentioned, I am the Director of Programs for ISEAL. We are a global organization that works on the credibility and impact of sustainability systems, like sustainability standards and other similar instruments. We also have a role on helping to push forward work on specific sustainability issues. So in that capacity, we are the Secretariat for the Global Living Wage Coalition Action Network, and we are also one of the partners that hosts the Living Income Community of Practice. So I am speaking here from the Living Income Community of Practice, the Global Living Wage Coalition, and ISEAL from all those fronts. Please, next slide, please. So I wanted to start today just with definitions and concepts to make sure that we are all on the same page about what we mean when we say living wage and living income. And what I'm presenting here represents, I think, the emerging global understanding of these terms. So both of the terms are related and derived from the concepts of a decent standard of living, a basic but decent standard of living, with the goal being that all households in the world would be at this living standard. So living wage is thinking about a single worker and how much a worker needs to earn in a standard work week to enable the family to then afford this decent standard of living. Whereas living income has primarily been applied in agriculture, although it could apply to other contexts as well, sort of small business contexts. And it's about the households engaged in farming earning sufficient in a year from all of their income sources to afford a decent standard of living. So the one applies to the individual worker, and we see the relevance to formal employment in particular, but it could be also applied to other ideas like gig workers or informal employment in many, many sectors. And living income is applied at the household level. Next slide, please. This concept of the decent standard of living, which is the foundation for the measurement of these different concepts, is definitely more ambitious than the poverty reduction language that we have used for many, many years at a kind of a global level. However, in the discussions of living income and the goal of reaching a decent standard of living, one of the other voices you hear is that this is definitely not the end goal, that we should look at decent standard of living as a step towards more prosperous income. Next slide. How do we actually measure these things in practice? So the leaders in deriving the measurement approach are Richard Anker and Martha Anker, who have documented their methodology in a book called Living Wages Around the World that was developed with support of the Global Living Wage Coalition. And there's been a lot of work over the last few years to see how that methodology, and in fact, even some of the measurement, directly applies to living wage, to living income, sorry. So one component of the measurement, or the key component of the measurement, is really understanding what does it actually cost in a particular area to have a basic but decent standard of living for a household of average size. And that is what the answer to that question is what we would call the living income benchmark. The methodology itself combines some primary data and secondary data collection and addresses the kinds of needs that you see here in the diagram. Important to note also that the goal is in each of these to think about what international standards of decency are. So for example, in terms of food, it's a question of what is the model diet that would achieve all of the calorie goals and also be locally relevant in different places. Next slide. So that same calculation becomes the basis for the calculation of living wage, where living wage benchmark is dividing this cost of a decent standard of living by the average number of workers in families in a particular area or country, and then adding back in what would come off of a salary in terms of payroll deductions. Now, so the concept here is that it isn't that one worker needs to support the whole family by him or herself, but let's say if you had two workers on average in households, that they would together be contributing to covering this cost of a decent standard of living. Next slide. So those are the living income and the living wage benchmark, so essentially an estimate of the goal. But for what we're interested in terms of seeing companies work towards progress on both of these fronts, we also need to understand what current worker wages are. So how much are people earning and what farmer incomes are. Next slide. So on the living income front, the point of interest is this income gap. So that's the difference between that cost of the decent standard of living in the area and what the household is actually earning. Now, important in this concept is what is the household earning from all sources of income, some of which are farm related, but you could also have off-farm income, you could have labor income, you could have other sorts of contributions that a household receives. And even within farm income, you can have income from different crops. Now, why is that important? It's important because, one, you can understand that the measurement side of this is more complicated than it would be if we were just looking at, say, what income do you earn from the sale of your cocoa, for example. But also because the strategies that one uses to close this gap are not the responsibility of any one actor. If you have companies working in coffee, they have a role, but you also have governments, and maybe you have, you may have other NGOs working on certain topics in an area who can also contribute. So it's really a living income strategy holistically for agriculture is multi-pronged, and it also has multiple actors. Next slide. So next is the wage gap. Now the wage gap is, it doesn't have all of those same complications in the sense that it's usually a bit clearer who is responsible for paying the wage, although there are still similar questions when you say, for example, if I'm buying from a factory, but I'm only buying 10% of the capacity, what's my responsibility in that case? Because the workers are working for many people. So depending on whether we're talking about your own operations or you're talking about your supply chain, some of the same questions might emerge in the wage case. Another important challenge in the wage side is that it's harder than you would think to actually say what are current wages that are being paid. Some very large multinationals have invested for years in databases and systems that allow them to actually have a consolidated picture of this. And also the payment of a living wage can be done in part by in-kind benefits. So let's say that you receive food or transportation or housing, how does that go towards the calculation of current wages? So there's some complexities here in figuring out the wage gap that do require some kind of rules and standardization if you were going to have people reporting in a standardized way on wage gap and wage gap closure. Next slide. The adoption of these concepts has really been growing quickly. I was involved in the first discussions in the Global Living Wage Coalition, really trying to just hammer out the definition of living wage about 9 years ago. And in the living income, which was adapted from living wage, starting maybe about 6 years ago. But in the last 2 to 3 years, we really see an uptake in the concepts in the private sector in particular, but also in governments and multinational organizations. Next slide. So as an example of this is a slide from a recent Living Income Community of Practice presentation where we had someone from Sustainalytics that is and works with impact investors talking about what they see in terms of the growing interest in the whole social side of ESG impacts. The motivation being in part one of greater recognition of wage and income as part of rights, but also the very practical needs, thinking about worker retention, thinking about reputation, thinking about secure supply in the agricultural case, is driving a lot of companies to really pay much more attention to these issues and to use the concepts of living wage and living income as framing for the strategies and commitments that they're making. Next slide. There are also a growing number of multi-stakeholder initiatives and groups that are working on living income and living wage. And here I just present some of them from the agricultural sector, but you can see they range from like the International Coffee Organization working on living income strategies to the European retailers in the banana sector working on living wage commitments together and doing studies. There was also a big multi-stakeholder initiative in Malawi on tea to try to raise both living income and living wage. So this has all been happening in the last few years. Next slide. There are also more and more cross-sector and global initiatives. So starting with the Global Living Wage Coalition and the Living Income Community of Practice, but now we have initiatives like Align, which is a database to help provide information to support corporate strategies. The Farmer Income Lab, which was started by Mars and other companies, looking at metrics and research. IDH, which has living income and living wage roadmap for companies, and even the OECD that is starting to develop a technical handbook on living income and living wage and how it fits into the broader due diligence framework. Next slide. Within the living income community of practice, we also see the membership growing. We have a very diverse membership in terms of type of organizations, many companies increasingly being involved, but also the attendance in the last few years expanding beyond Europe to also reach into Latin America, Africa, and Asia, for example, and increasing interest in that area, driven in large part by discussions within commodity markets like cocoa and coffee. But I do think that the concept would also be taken up in other areas. Next slide. At the recent UN Food Systems Summit, there was also a lot of tension to living income and living wage. The Food Summit ended with a number of coalitions of action, one of which was on decent work and living income and wages. And that coalition is being led by CARE, IFAD, and ILO. And the World Business Council for Sustainable Development is also working on the private sector side of this. Also recently, ILO had a decision to begin some work and research around the topic of living wage. This living wage had been a topic that ILO stayed away from because of the focus on minimum wages and the idea that minimum wages actually should be living wages. But in a recent multi-stakeholder decision, they decided to actually start to explore this topic. So there's also movement on that front. Next slide. We also see interesting applications and tools being developed to actually help companies put this into practice. There are those who are producing the living wage and living income benchmarks now available in many different areas of the world. There are also tools for helping to measure wage gaps and also income gaps. And then there are organizations like Fairtrade who are taking the concept of living income, which remember is a household level concept, and then developing methodologies to say, how would that apply to something like a corporate decision about what to pay for a commodity? So this living income reference prices idea says, essentially, what should the price for a commodity be if the goal is to support that, that farming household in earning a living income? Next slide. So as, of course, the more interest in this concept comes up and we see more commitments, that we also see growing interest in reporting and disclosure. So I think your thoughts about whether or not you want to be doing more work on this area is very well timed. Next slide. Here are just some examples of initiatives that are already out there thinking about this reporting question. So on the living wage side on the left, we have Shift working on an accounting model that companies can use to measure and publicly report on their progress on living wages, both in their own workforces and also in their supply chains. Then we have the World Benchmarking Alliance, which has added some indicators to some of their benchmarks on living wage. And an important point here is to say that they're looking, when they do that, they're looking not just at the living wage itself, but also what are some of the other things that support payment of a living wage. So collective bargaining and working hours, for example, being an important part of that. And then IDH's living wage roadmap, where they've identified 2 indicators that they're asking companies who use their salary matrix to report on. Similarly, in the living income community of practice, there is guidance on how to measure some of the key indicators like the income gap and different approaches to doing that and what the recommendations are. Next slide. Also, in the living income community of practice, we've had a lot of discussions recently about the question of reporting and disclosure. So what should actually be expected? And as the community of practice is a multi-stakeholder platform, we have different views on this, but I thought I would share just this one slide, again, from Sustainalytics, who I mentioned are in the impact investing space. Stina Nilsson shared her thoughts on what is needed in terms of disclosure. So she's saying here disclosure on both the income baseline, so where you're starting with the farmers in your supply chain that are in areas that are of high risk for this, and comparing it to the living income benchmark to end up with the gap, but also on how the results of these studies then are informing your strategy and your action, and how you're looking at the context. Market price fluctuations and other factors have a big influence on these things. And so how does your strategy address that? So she's essentially saying some disclosure on strategy and actions, as well as on outcome and impact, and then reflection on how what's happening, your outcomes, are actually driving your strategy. Next slide. Then there are organizations, ISEAL being one of them, but there are others and some government regulation as well that are also providing increased scrutiny on company claims and reporting more generally, which I'm sure you're aware of, and which also affect how we think about what should be done on living wage and living income. So amongst those, ISEAL's credibility principles, the truthfulness of claims and reporting being very important. And then also recent ISEAL guidance on how to structure and manage and think about the claims that companies can make, for example, in the work that they're doing at a landscape level. One important part of our thinking here is about how the measurement and claim structure actually incentivize investment and improvement. So in both living income and living wage, you really need companies to be investing in supply chain or in higher payments for products or for workers. So how does the reporting and measurement framework actually make it attractive for companies to do that? For example, through their relationship with investors and others and the public. Next slide. So just to close, a few considerations for you as you go forward. At first, I would say that overall, I would definitely agree living wage and or living income are highly material for most of the sectors you will be working in, and therefore thinking about some kind of topic standard on these seems to make a lot of sense. Now, how it applies to the sectors is going to depend on whether you think about it just in a kind of an own operations perspective, or you also think about supply chain. So that's an important important decision or value chain. And I heard you raise that also around the biodiversity as well. Important to remember here that the two concepts are very different. People like to throw them together. And although they are based all on this idea of the decent standard of living, there are these important differences. Is it about one worker? Is it about a farming household? Is it the way that you think about the role and responsibility of companies in achieving it is also different. And there are different kinds of measurement challenges. Companies are looking for guidance, I think, on reporting and disclosure on this front. That's one of the reasons why we're having this active discussion in the living income community of practice. And it is clear that there are multiple evolving initiatives out there, and more alignment around that would be useful and needed. It's important also to recognize where there already is alignment. As I mentioned, there's been work over a number of years to align on things like definitions. So there are certain things that can, I think, be taken as, if not 100% consensus, at least they are well established and others are already building on them. So there's some basis there. On the reporting side, one of the big challenges is going to be that what we really want to know is whether income and wage gaps are closing, right? But this measurement of what those gaps are is complicated for reasons that I already mentioned before. So what people can actually say, what they can disclose, and also whether we should reasonably expect everything to always move in the right direction is a complicating factor. When world prices change, when inflation goes up very quickly, it takes a little while for systems and strategies to adapt. So how to deal with that, I think, is important. And finally, as I mentioned earlier, obviously, the approach to having truthful measurement and reporting is very key, but the information should also be really meaningful and designed to incentivize further investment. Not just, I think, reporting for reporting's sake, because the companies that are doing this or are starting to make these commitments still need to be encouraged to do more, to invest more, and they're looking for some recognition of that. So how can we recognize real meaningful efforts in a truthful way, I think, is the challenge in this area going forward. And I'll stop there and answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much, Kristen. I'd like to invite the GSSB members to raise their hands or to share any questions or discussion points that they might like to. Peter Colley, please go ahead.
Thank you. Look, very interesting presentation, fascinating presentation. Thank you so much. In your discussion of living income, you talked about multifactorial approach, should I call it, multi-pronged approach. There are different actors supplying income. How does this relate to the provision on a social security basis of certain parts of the standard of living? I think in particularly of healthcare and education, which vary enormously from country to country in how they're provided, from not well provided and user pays basis to, the United States for healthcare has private health insurance provided by the employer, whereas in the United Kingdom and Australia, healthcare is provided on a universal basis, a universal access basis.
Exactly.
How is that reflected in living income?
So if we could go back to one of the slides towards the beginning where I had this graph showing the income gap. So it's like, I think slide 4 or 5. That question actually gets picked up on the side of estimating what is the cost of a decent standard of living. Because then what that means is that the cost varies significantly from one place to the next. So the previous slide would be good. The one right before that. Yes, this one. So if you look at that box that shows what are the costs of a decent standard of living, part of that is healthcare, for example. And the cost of healthcare, what it costs to an individual, is going to differ very much from one country to another, which is precisely why both of these concepts are place-based concepts. You know, one of the areas in discussion now is how small is the place to making it meaningful? You know, are we talking country? Are we talking region? Are we talking, you know, a few towns? Because the costs do differ also within a country. So I think we've settled at this point on it's not national, it's subnational, really, but it's not necessarily a very, very small area because we need something also workable. As an example of this, if anyone is familiar with the US, there's an organization called Living Wage for US that does these calculations for the US, and they use the Obamacare costs. For example, so Obamacare is a kind of a standardized insurance package, and that package, the cost of that package varies by state. So they use that differential cost in these calculations. Okay? So that's why to make this concept effective in practice, what you need is these benchmarks for the different areas that you're interested in. And there has been a lot of progress at doing that, and there are a lot more estimates available now, a lot, than there were, you know, years ago. But it's still a barrier for some companies to be able to report it everywhere because you may be missing this. There, you know, what do people use as a stand-in if they don't have it? There are poverty, they can use a poverty line figure, for example, which would be a lower bar, but could be used as a stand-in for what is the goal. And you also have some innovation in approaches to calculating or estimating, I should say, rather, what the cost of a decent standard of living is using secondary data sources, that kind of thing. So it's an evolving art and science as we go along. So I hope that gave you some sense of how it's being tackled.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. Other questions? Maybe I'll just, I don't know if this is a question or maybe just a sort of jumping off point for a little bit of further conversation. It seems to me that there is something in the kind of overlap, Kristen, in your presentation, the way that you have framed these concepts, which sort of causes disclosure and kind of encouragement and benchmarking type of activities, you know, overlapping one another. And GRI's role is quite clearly around disclosure standards. And of course, we want the disclosures to help to make better decisions towards better outcomes on a sustainability sort of, you know, impact dimension. But I just wonder if you could speak a little bit further to, you know, how do we, I understand that they, in order to achieve those outcomes, there does need to be these kind of supporting activities around benchmarking and various ways in which companies or issuers might be credited with the activities that they're doing. But just kind of recognizing that in the kind of strictest sense, that's not GRI's role. How do we actually kind of define what our role is here, and what would you see as the interplay between potential GRI standards on this area and some of those wider activities?
Yeah, so taking living income as an example, since we have this slide up, the position of the living income community practice is that understanding, for example, this income gap is a first step to designing a strategy. So, for example, when a company comes out or a sector comes out and says, we recognize that almost all of the farmers who are growing X commodity are living are not earning a decent standard of living, right? I mean, that in and of itself itself, I think, is the starting point for driving action and raising awareness. So there's disclosure on that kind of basic information, which I think is helpful. The other part of this is in terms of taking responsibility, do companies know where they're sourcing from? Do they know what the risk is or the extent of the issue in the places where they're working? What are their policies and procedures on things that will affect the outcomes that on the ground? So, things like procurement policies or approaches and other things. It would be great to have people be able to disclose what prices they're paying, but that one is a difficult one. Also, what wages are being paid. Mm-hmm. But I guess there's enough work being done on what are some of the supportive policies and approaches that that underlie responsible corporate action on both of these topics that could be included in more of a disclosure approach.
Right. Okay.
And maybe if I could just jump in here.
Sure.
I think just from the conversations that we've seen, on this topic, a lot of companies, when they want to take action, they're always looking at where's the low-hanging fruit, what can I do first, what can I talk about, and what we want to do is move people away from that. Just think about the supply base, where the most vulnerable as part of human rights and trying to meet human rights for everyone. It is about reaching the most vulnerable and being able to support them through this. And so when you look at reporting and disclosure, we have to be very clear, what is the purpose of us reporting? What do we want to do ultimately? And then start to think about just as you publicly report on your processes or your commitments or actions, how do that then address these kind of risk areas, the most vulnerable? So really providing that guidance to companies, I think it's very useful so that they don't go away and just think very narrowly about just low-hanging fruits or small wins in specific areas, but really just what's the intention of us doing this? It's not to catch up companies, but really we want to improve the situation, and having good disclosure and reporting around the right indicators that tell the story, even if it's not the best story or it's, there are gaps, but the main aim is the improvement side. So I think it's getting better at reporting and disclosing the right things will help the situation.
Yeah.
Okay,
yeah,
thank you
I guess
very much.
maybe just to further clarify that, I don't think we can expect that there are going to be many companies who can come out and disclose, well, or even say that they are paying a living wage to every worker in their value chain, for example. That's sort of, we're not at that point. So the question is, what is reasonable for them to disclose, and how does that disclosure help encourage their further progress?
Okay, thank you very much for that. And I suppose, Harold, why don't I go to you? Yeah, you've just raised your hand. Go ahead, Harold, and then we'll see if anybody else has any other discussion questions.
Thank you, and thank you for the presentation. Yeah, a small question. So in our GRI 13, in the just released sector standard for the agriculture, we included a real topic on this, and the living income and living wage. So of course you gave the recommendation that it could be interesting for all sectors. In our research, we saw that for in the agriculture sector, it's more than 4 times more likely to have poverty than into other sectors. So in the work of even the labor standards, I think, even the 401 standard, the question would be, of course, would we like to approach this in a topic standard, or would we rather do this sector specific? Where that I think that would really be the question, and I would like to Do you have an answer on that yet, or maybe we could elaborate and discuss that later? But that would be my question.
I'll let Sheila share her views after mine, but I would say that on living income, the strongest momentum at the moment is in ag, right? So it takes some further work for the concept to be applied in other sectors. So I think depends on, I mean, food and beverage companies are also really looking at this, but they're looking at it because of the reliance on the agricultural commodity. So depending on how that fits in your system, I would say for living income, that's the scope. On living wage, it's much broader, and again, this goes to whether it's own operations or whether it's also the value chain. But I think there are many companies looking at this very broadly across in various different sectors. So there, I would argue that it's broader. I mean, on agriculture and labor, so living wage in agriculture, there's another challenge there, which is that you have the more formalized labor, like let's say on a plantation, and then you have a lot of informal labor where the living wage concept is very valuable, but it's harder for companies to have any information about that, and a lot of the actual employers are also small businesses in and of themselves and that kind of thing. So I think there's also a decision there to be made about own operations value chain, and then what part of value chain to decide how you're going to apply it across multiple sectors. Sheila, would you agree with me on the living income?
Yeah. Again, I don't know fully how the system works with sector-specific or topic standard and how people reference it, but it's true that for living income, we have a lot more work in specific sectors, but this point on can this be applied broadly to other sectors has also come up in our discussion, and we've started trying to just see, can we take the concept and apply it to other sectors, and what would it mean? What changes would that mean? As you can see, if you look at the graphics, we've tweaked it slightly. We used to have a farmer there, and now we're trying to see, can we adapt that to other sectors as well? So it's something to think about. At the end of the day, we're trying to keep it as simple as possible in order to help people in this journey. And while it might not be fleshed out for other sectors, I think there's real need for everyone to just start looking at this in a bit more detail. So might need a bit more just thinking, how do you take what we know in specific sectors and apply it more broadly? Again, I wouldn't have like the best answer at this point, but it's definitely come up in a lot of our conversations as well.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Very interesting. So I think we will come back to that. Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions or comments from GSSB members? Any kind of further thoughts, Kristen or Sheila, that you would like to share at this point?
I want to thank you for the opportunity to share this with you. It was interesting to listen to what you were saying about the biodiversity standard and the kind of partnerships that you'd set up for trying to align and think about where things are going, especially since it's an emerging concept. I would say we're in the same place with these pieces, and so would just really encourage you, if you take this forward, to also start out by identifying who are those organizations and where is this concept being taken forward, to see if the work that you do can also further support more collaboration and alignment between them.
Yeah, I'd echo
sorry, go ahead.
I'd echo the same thing. There's a lot of initiatives that we see popping up, and I would say, if you do take this up, there's a vast amount of work that's already been done in terms of definitions, in terms of the concepts, in terms of just application, what has worked, what is not, that can be drawn from to help with, just defining what are good reporting or disclosure protocols and just what's needed at this point. So we don't have to have everything, but let's start and what's needed. So just reference as much as possible the ongoing initiatives from like the GLWC or the LICOP where it's available.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much indeed for that. We certainly will continue to evaluate this as we look to set our forthcoming work program. And there are numerous projects ongoing at the moment or about to begin, such as the one we just talked about today around the opening up of a project looking at the labor-related standards, which may have a bearing on or may be influenced by some of these concepts as well. And so therefore the timing is rather good for us to be considering this as well. Okay, we are behind schedule, obviously, because of the technical challenges that we've had, but I think we've come to the end of our public agenda here. I'd like to thank Kristen and Sheila in particular for joining us today. Are there any other points from GSSB members, any closing thoughts or anything that we haven't talked about today that you would like to make sure that we do in the public session before we close this meeting? Okay. Thank you very much. Then it just remains for me to say that is the end of our public meeting, and we will look forward to reconvening at the next opportunity in a few weeks' time. Offhand, I can't remember what the date of the next meeting is, to be perfectly honest, but it's on the GSSB website. And thank you for your time, and we can now close out the public meeting.
Thank you.